So I decided I wanted to make a video kind of talking about my first year as a school psychologist, horror stories. So I'm gonna break it down from the elementary school to the middle school, and I'll let you know the things that I've experienced so far. So to start, at the elementary school, there's a lot of things revolving around trauma. And it's like, for example, I had a kid come in, actually there was two of them, and I had to talk to them. I think I mentioned this in a different video, but I had to talk to them because the night before, there was someone that was shot in their neighborhood, and they just burst into their house, and they said that there was blood everywhere, and you know, they obviously were traumatized, and the people who were with this person was threatening the family, saying they need to help them or else there's going to be consequences because of the neighborhood that they live in. And obviously the mom's like freaking out, and eventually they ended up having to move just because I think they were being threatened by the person that was shot. So these kids are elementary school age and they experience that. So that's what I mean by there's like lots of trauma related things that happen there, and that's just one of many. But that seems to be a common thing at the school that I'm at, is that these kids are exposed to like shootings and their friends being shot, or people in their neighborhoods being shot and killed. Things like that. Abuse is another type of common horror story that seems to happen. So like, perfect example, I had to do, it was a suicide assessment. That's what it started as, but then we realized that the kid was saying all these things because at home, the person that they live with, like their guardian, would just berate them and talk about how they're ugly and how no one loves them and they don't deserve to be treated well, and would beat them up for no reason. And the kid just did not feel safe going home. So this also, we were doing this at the end of the day, this assessment, and we're like, well, what are we gonna do? Because the kid has, you know, like the kid's about to go home, but the kid doesn't feel safe going home. So we're calling around, and it was just super hectic, because when something like that happens, if it's a regular suicide assessment, you just call the parent guardian. But if it's a suicide assessment that then they feel scared of going back home, you have to call like CPS, and that's just, it's a whole thing. And that's what we had to do. But that's another horror story. Went in thinking it was one thing, it turned out to be something completely different. And for the elementary school, neglect is a whole other like common horror story occurrence. For example, there have been kids that are at the elementary school, and literally the mom will have a kid that's 5, 4, and you know, they're at the elementary school, and then at home they have a kid that's 3, 2, and 1 years old. And then these kids come in and they just are wearing dirty clothes, they haven't eaten, their feet are like black, or their arms are, you know, just because they're dirty. And that seems to be a common horror story occurrence that is at the elementary school. There's a couple kids that are like that. And another story that I have that I kind of was touching on in a recent video that I did, and I count this as neglect, but a kid that is acting out and the parent is not providing any discipline. So there's a kid like that where the kid will like make moaning sounds, say very inappropriate things that the kid wants to do to other students in the classroom. And this kid is, I think, like 5 or 6, so super young, and saying these things. And if you give the kid any sort of consequence, the kid does not care. They're like, oh well, because their mom doesn't care. And you tell the mom, and the mom's like, well, you know, they're just joking around, it's fine. And I count that as neglect, because you're not disciplining your child and setting them up to know how to react to things in the future and handle things, and kind of just letting things slide by. And when they're really young, you can only let them slide by for so long, because if they grow up like that, that's when more problems occur. And I don't know, to me, that's neglect. But that's another horror story where we just don't know what to do with the kid, because we tell the parent and the parent doesn't care. And because the parent doesn't care and the kid knows that the parent doesn't care, the kid just comes in and does whatever they want. And it's like, there's no consequence for them at home. So they just kind of terrorize the other kids. And then the parent also tries to get rid of any punishments that the school may give, like if they try to suspend the kid or take away things. Like, now at the middle school, I'm not going to put the horror stories into categories like how I did for the elementary school, but I'm just going to talk about like different occurrences that happen. So like one horror story I have is there was a kid that was autistic, and just they said he likes to touch things, and one thing that this kid does is like go up and hits girls' boobs, and I'm like, that's very inappropriate, regardless of, you know, whatever disability anyone may have, because if you do that out in public, yeah. So I know I had a kid that I had to test, and there really wasn't a reason for me to test them. Like, we knew that they had autism, and I didn't feel like it was necessary, but it was already written down that I'd have to test them. And then when I went in for the testing, you know, for the IQ test, you have little blocks, and they have to, like, they're hard and they're cubes, and you have to arrange them into whatever is presented on the page. Well, this kid took the blocks, started throwing them, stood up on the table, and was about to start kicking stuff, and I was like, I'm not doing anymore. I sent the kid back. That was my report. I was not writing anymore. I was not going to try to test this kid any further. There was no need to. I was not putting myself at risk. I did not feel comfortable around this kid. That was the beginning of the year, like when I first started working. Nope, not doing it. Another thing that happened, there was a kid that flipped out just because I went to test them on a day that they didn't want to be tested. They told me to come a different day. I'm only there certain days a week. I'm only there Monday and Tuesday. And when I can test is when I can test. So this kid's walking around, talking to all their friends, going the opposite direction, trying to go to the nurse's office. Security is like telling them to listen to me. They're kind of giving security an attitude, and I'm like, okay, like, if you're not gonna come, I'm gonna have to get the principal to escort you down. And that's when they just flipped, calling me names, cursing me out, cursing out security. We did have to get the principal. We had to get the CIS. I think it was the CIS coordinator. No, it wasn't. No, yeah, the CIS coordinator, because this kid listened to them, and they had to like basically talk some sense into them, because they then said, yeah, I didn't want to do it because it's on a day that I didn't feel like doing it. And I'm like, I wasn't going to, because if they're saying they don't want to and they're being like defiant, that would have been my report. But the CIS coordinator was able to convince them, and so they did it, and we finished it. This was already like my 4th day of testing, just because this kid like constantly needed breaks and constantly like had something to say. So that's something that happened that I had to deal with too. And when I took the student down to test, they were like, I was having a perfectly fine, nice day until you got me. I just ignored that comment. There was another kid at this school that had behavioral problems at home as well as in the school. And by behavioral problems, I mean like we were having a meeting that day. It was supposed to happen, but as soon as this kid's meeting was supposed to happen, in their classroom, they started banging their head on their desk, and you could hear it from our office. And then they picked up the desks and started throwing them, and the teacher had to get all of their students out of there. It was crazy. So when I tested the student, they were nice, but got distracted quick, and then just had odd behavior, like was sitting there answering the question and then puts their hood up and like tightens it and just slunks down to the floor and is in fetal position. And I'm like, okay, well, we can go back to class. And they're like, no, wait, I don't want to go back to class. But eventually we found this kid ED, and they actually ended up going to a school that specializes in behaviors, because they would go into other classrooms and disrupt them, throw things, just say things, get in teachers' faces and tell them how they couldn't do anything, or else they get in trouble. So stuff like that. And then lastly, the last story I'm gonna tell you about, that's like a horror story. It's more like there's sad things that happen too at the middle school. Just kind of, I guess, I mean, if they had trauma and hardships in elementary school, of course it's just gonna build up when they're in middle school. So there's a student that I had, and they just didn't want to live with their mom. They went to go live with their dad because they said they're the oldest and their mom just treats them so badly, won't let them do anything, gets them in trouble for everything, even if their siblings do the same thing. And I guess kind of just takes their own anger out on them and contradicts herself. Like, will tell them, go get a job. They want to get a job, and then the mom's like, no, and flips out. With that situation, I know they were going to go live with their dad starting in the summer, even though the mom didn't want them to. The dad said they would get them, and that is that. I actually have to check up on that student, so I'm probably gonna do that as well. So I'm telling you these stories because it's just what I experienced in my first year, and things that aren't talked about. Like, I tell you guys all the good stories, and there are a lot of good stories, and we do make a lot of changes in kids' lives, I feel like, and we help them to do the best that they can while they're in school. But I think people don't talk about the bad that happens in the job and things that you might experience and how you deal with them. And it's difficult, but it's something that happens. Obviously, each school is different. Each school has a different environment, different stressors, different neighborhoods. So your experience is going to be different depending on where you work and where you live. But this was just my experience that I've had so far in my first year that I consider like for sure horror stories. Maybe I'll make this a thing, like horror stories that happened, if you guys are interested. And honestly, I'm probably gonna do an overview of the whole like second half of my first year as well, because I know I did a midway video. So maybe I'll do either a whole year in review, or like the second half of the year. But yeah, so I hope that you guys enjoyed this. And I even tried to add in the light to make it a little bit darker in here. You can get cozy while watching this. So yeah, I really hope that you guys enjoyed. And you know, as always, if you have any feedback, leave a comment down below. I will see you guys next time. Bye guys.